Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for staying after coffee and not just, having a nice rest. So my point of departure is thinking about what neuroaesthetics has achieved as a field, and I think we can all agree that it's achieved a great deal. So we've made great advances in the last 20 years. We've learned where in the brain activity happens linked to appreciation of art, aesthetics. We know a lot about the time course of such activity. We've started identifying neurotransmitter pathways that underlie aesthetic experience. And I think all of this leads to the conclusion that we're consolidating the field as a proper subfield in cognitive neuroscience, which I think is a great achievement that owes to the work of many people, many whom are sitting in the audience now. And when we think about the sort of neuroaesthetics that we would want for tomorrow and imagine, what do we want to achieve in the next 20 years? Well, I particularly would like to see more why questions. So why these brain regions? Why this time course? Why these neurotransmitter pathways? Why does aesthetic appreciation involve these systems? And I think these sort of why questions lead to, thinking about evolution. So how did these brain systems come to be integrated and come to be essential for our experience of art and aesthetics. So the question that I would like to entertain is how can knowledge of the evolution of aesthetics contribute to the next stage of neuroaesthetics? So this, in other fields, is absolutely a trivial question. So imagine that I'm doing research on bipedal locomotion in humans, and the question would be, how can knowledge of the evolution of primate locomotion systems inform our understanding of human bipedal locomotion? It's trivial. It's very informative. It's obvious that understanding how the evolution of locomotion is very informative to understanding how humans walk and stand erect. So it's an interesting question to ask. Might sound a little trivial, but the situation in neuroaesthetics is that it doesn't get asked very much or answered very much. So what I would like to imagine for the next 20 years is that we could come up with some sort of a cognitive phylogeny of aesthetic experience. And cognitive phylogenies work very much like phylogenies based on physical traits, which is grouping of organisms based on similarity and phylogenetic relationship, based on the premise of descent with modification. So the idea that certain physical traits appear at some point during the evolution and then they are transmitted to the next generations with some sort of a modification. And this allows us to pinpoint when and where in the lineage a given trait appeared. So the fact that all land animals have lungs indicate that at some point an ancestor of all land animals evolved a new sort of organ that allowed them to breathe air on land surface. And throughout evolution, all the animals that descended from that still carry lungs in different shapes and ways. So cognitive phylogenies work in very much the same way. So you have an example here about a cognitive phylogeny of gaze sensitivity and geometric gaze following by Fitch and colleagues. So gaze sensitivity is the ability to detect that people are looking in a certain direction or other animals are looking in a certain direction. And geometric gaze following is the ability to understand that if I want to know where you're looking at, and sometimes there's an object that's blocking my field of vision, I need to reorient and understand that you're looking at something that I can't see directly. So these are two very different cognitive abilities, and by checking what sort of animals possess these abilities, Fitch and colleagues have come up with a cognitive phylogeny that allows them to hypothesize that gaze sensitivity appeared at some point in the evolution of animals many millions of years ago in the last common ancestor of amniotes. By checking whether other animals are capable of geometric gaze following, they can see that this is very much restricted. So only primates, very few mammals, and some birds are capable of geometric gaze following, which suggests this is a much more recent development and that even might have developed or appeared in evolution at several different points in time and in different lineages. So it would be nice to have some sort of at least tentative cognitive phylogeny of our capacity to appreciate the aesthetic of objects, whether artworks or not artworks, came into happening. So the question of how how can knowledge of the evolution of aesthetics contribute to the next stage of aesthetics? I think we can seek example in related fields, and people have been asking, for instance, how can knowledge of the evolution of preference and decision making contribute to understanding how humans develop preferences and make decisions? So a lot of information here. Many studies have shown that, like humans, for instance, monkeys avoid options when they're framed as losses. So monkeys show this loss aversion effect. Monkeys also tend to overweigh the end of an episode, showing again a peak end effect, which is known to also happen in humans. And like humans, monkeys refuse to trade food that they own for equally valued tokens. So this is some sort of an endowment effect. So we see, and we could go on with this list. So we see that humans share with other primates many of the design features of their choice and preference. And this is like if I have a car and I talk to Ocean about my car and I say, well, you know, Ocean, it's difficult to get it running in the morning, you know, it chokes a little. And he says, well, yeah, my car, you know, it also happens to me. And I tell him, yeah, and it, you know, sort of steers to the left. And he says, well, my goodness, my car does that also. And, you know, when I shift from second to third gear, it like crunches. And he says, oh my God, that happens in my car also. Well, maybe we'd start thinking that this car was manufactured by the same people. It has so many design features in common, it might come from the same factory even. So this is basically what's going on here. The way we choose, the way we prefer as humans shows so many design features in common with how monkeys choose that the possibility or the reality is that the design features and our heuristics and choices come from the same basic primate design. So biases and heuristics appeared at some point in the evolution of primates very early on, and these mechanisms that guide our preferences and choices have been handed down from generation to generation with certain modifications, but they constitute elementary aspects of sort of primate cognition. Why has this sort of approach been limited in the domain of aesthetics? Well, I think it has to do with the way we think about our object of study. So some people believe that what we study, so responses to beauty or responses to aesthetics or responses to artworks, somehow separate humans from other animals. So this capacity to enjoy aesthetics and art is sort of a barrier that demarcates humans and separates us from animals and sometimes even elevates us above other animals, making the problem of understanding how we came to possess this ability a very difficult problem to solve. This sort of idea leads to the conclusion that whatever it is in our brains and cognitive systems that allows us to enjoy the aesthetics and beauty and artworks must have appeared after we split from chimpanzees. This again, if we establish the analogy with bipedal locomotion and we translate these paragraphs, so for instance, if I said, bipedal locomotion is among the traits that elevate man above the brutes, this renders the problem of the origin of bipedal locomotion particularly challenging. So this is a very strange claim to make. It's even strange to claim that everything that contributes to bipedal locomotion in humans appeared after the human lineage had separated from the apes. That's another very strange claim to make, because even though we acquired bipedal locomotion after we separated from chimpanzees, basically every bone in our body we share with chimpanzees. It's just that, you know, things have shifted and changed and reorganized and allowed us to walk upright. But evolution of bipedal locomotion didn't start 7 million years ago with the split of humans and chimpanzees. So there's a lot in human locomotion that comes into human locomotion. There's also different opinions. So there's, for instance, Grant Allen wrote that this apparent distinction between humans and lower animals is like all other artificial distinctions where we seek to hide our community of origin between us and other animals. But this distinction fades when you look at the little details. And in any case, I think the matter of whether aesthetic is a human unique trait or we share the basic common elements with other primates is a basically empirical question. So already in 1940, Edwin Boring called for an animal aesthetics, so for an empirical animal aesthetics. Unfortunately, if you look in the literature, there are dotted studies out there that we could classify into 3 categories. So the first category would be studies that have looked at whether other animals are sensitive to the sort of cues that we use to learn about artistic style and about artistic quality. Other studies that have looked about into preferences of other animals for features that have some clear biological significance and some social cues. And then other studies have looked into preferences for features that have less clear biological significance. I'm not saying that they don't have any biological significance, it's just that it's less clear compared to the ones in category 2. So let me just run through some of these studies. So sensitivity to artistic style and quality. It turns out that pigeons can learn to discriminate between artistic styles. So I'll just give you an idea of how these experiments are run. So you keep a pigeon hungry, so about 80% of its normal body weight, so it's motivated to work for food. And in this study, they rewarded pigeons for picking either on the screen when a Picasso painting was shown or when a Monet painting was shown. And they learned to discriminate this fairly quickly because they got food when they did the correct pecking, so they're pecking on one of the 2 artists. And they were trained until they got 90% correct. So this is like a threshold where we can think that the pigeon has learned to distinguish these artists. And then they go into a test phase where they're shown 10 new Picassos and 10 new Monets and the 10 old Picassos and then the 10 old Monets. So they're seeing the old paintings and the new paintings together. And the idea is to see whether the pigeons have learned to distinguish a Picasso style from a Monet style. So what's interesting here is to see how they'll peck to the new paintings. They haven't seen these before. So what happens is, as you can see here, the pigeons that were trained to see the Monets, when they shown the new Monets, they still peck on them quite often. So each bar here represents one of the pigeons, which was trained to pick on the Monets, and these bar here represent each of the pigeons that was trained to peck on the Picassos during the training phase. So what they do is that they peck on the old Monets quite a lot, but they also peck on the new Monets, and the pigeons who were familiarized or trained with the Picassos peck on the old Picassos and also peck on the new Picassos, but they don't peck on the old paintings that they weren't trained to peck on, or on the new paintings from the artists they weren't trained to peck on. So they sort of generalize an artistic style to new paintings. Pigeons can also discriminate between Van Goghs and Chagalls. Sparrows can also learn to discriminate between Cubism, Impressionism, and Japanese paintings, and even mice can be trained to discriminate between artist style. Interestingly, pigeons can also be trained to discriminate between paintings that have been classified as good artworks by children or as bad artworks by children. So it's not only style they can recognize, but also artistic merit or artistic quality, if you want to think about this. So the setup is pretty much the same. The pigeons are trained either to peck on artworks that have been classified by art teachers as being good paintings or as bad paintings. So this is, children's drawings. So some pigeons are reinforced for pecking on the good artworks, some pigeons are reinforced for pecking on the bad artworks. So what will happen when we show them new exemplars of good artworks and bad artworks? Well, again, the pigeons perform really well here. So they sort of generalize in this sort of set of paintings by children what constitutes a good painting and what constitutes a bad painting. So come to think of it, one of the conclusions of this study is that pigeons are just as good as art teachers in judging the paintings of children. So you might substitute grading by pigeon pecks. In this study, they were able to determine that part of the cues that the pigeons were attending to when they were pecking is color and good continuation, because when they took the color away from the paintings, the pigeons lost their ability to discriminate good from bad, and when they scrambled the images, they also lost that ability. So it has something to do with color and good continuation. So if we have to conclude something from these studies, is that animals in general, at least pigeons and mice, are able to learn the sort of cues that discriminate between artist styles and between art quality, just as humans throughout their lives also learn to discriminate between artist styles and what constitutes art, good art and bad art. So we turn now to the second category of studies, preference for biologically relevant features, and this is just goes to show how ingenious scientists can be. So in this study, they trained 2 monkeys to choose between getting juice or between getting juice and an image. So the monkeys had a central fixation cross, and after a certain time, they get 2 targets. And just by moving their eye to target 1 or to target 2, that gives them the chance to get a certain amount of juice, say 100 milliliters of juice. This is something that they like and they're deprived of in their daily lives. But if they move their eyes to target 2, they get juice and also an image on screen. So by changing the amount of juice that they get when they look to target 1 and to target 2, the experimenters can quantify how much the monkeys are willing to sacrifice or invest in terms of juice to see the images. So if the monkey really wants to see one of those images, he might look to target 2, even though he's getting less juice than when he moves his eye to target 1. So when he moves his eyes to target 1, he gets 100 milliliters, but when he moves his eye to target 2, he gets 80 milliliters, but an image he likes, he might continue doing that for trial after trial. So we know that that image has the value of 20 milliliters of juice. So the sort of images that they were getting are socially informative images, basically female posteriors, and images of faces of high status and low status males. So the females and the males in the photographs were part of their community. So these are individuals that they know and understand the hierarchy on a daily basis. So the results of this study show that the monkeys are willing to, let's say, pay to see images of the female posteriors and images of the faces of high-ranking male individuals in their community. And they're not willing to see, so the green bars are the faces of the low-ranking male individuals, so the experimenters actually have to give extra juice to the monkeys so they move to target 2 and get to see the images of the low-ranking male individuals. So they have to be bribed to see the low-ranking males, but they're willing to pay to see ladies' bums and high-status male faces. And if you're wondering whether this is common to humans, I think Helmut referred to this same study. Humans are willing to pay, or in money terms, not in juice. The setup of this experiment was very similar to the one with the monkeys. It's by the same research group. And they showed that humans, especially men, are willing to sacrifice monetary reward to view faces of attractive people of the opposite sex. And they're also willing to work harder to see these images. So in the other study, they had to press 2 different keys in a very awkward position for a certain amount of time to be exposed to the images. So this shows that we humans and we primates in general have a deep fascination for attractive and high status individuals, and this is well known and exploited by publicity because they know that we're attracted to these images and we create associations between the brands and the images, both with images of sexy people and high status people. So the same research group wondered whether monkeys will also establish these associations between attractive individuals or high status individuals and the brands. So what they did here is again pair brand logos with either social images, so the 3 photographs at the top row, and then non-social images, which are the same images but just scrambled, so they have the same visual properties, just it doesn't show the face. And the brands could be paired with dominant male individuals, subordinate male individuals, or with female posteriors. And they were then given a choice between the 2 logos that had been paired with different sorts of images. So as you can imagine, when given a choice just of the logos, the monkeys tend to choose more often the logo that previously had been paired with female posteriors or with high status male faces, rather than choosing the logo that had been paired with the low status male face. So, as in humans, monkeys are able to associate social information, interesting social information, attractive social information, with neutral stimuli that become then rewarding based on that association. So primates, the conclusion would be primates, including humans, place high value on socially informative feature in that they're willing to sacrifice resources and they're willing to work for them, and that this value can be translated into preferences for objects that initially have no reward value. So again, there seems to be in preferences for social and for biologically relevant images some sort of a basic mechanism that we share with with relatively close animals like other primates, monkeys. A number of studies have examined less obvious biologically relevant images or objects, like this study published a couple of years ago that showed that mice spontaneously prefer to explore objects that have a certain proportion. Specifically in this case, mice were sensitive to proportion, so they rather spend time exploring and interacting with objects that were just like metal cylinders that have a proportion 1.2 rather than a proportion close to the golden section or 1.8. The reason for this preference is unclear. In another study, they gave capuchin monkeys and squirrel monkeys the opportunity to pick up little cards that could be either regular or irregular. And here you have two sets. They used two sets, and there were 8 pairs of cards in each set. And in each pair, there was a regular card and an irregular card. And the monkey was put into its little cage, and there were the cards. And the experimenters checked what sort of cards the monkeys were interacting with. Did they pick this up? Did they play with it? And it turns out that for both categories and for both sorts of primates, the preferred card was the regular card. So monkeys, the capuchin monkeys and the squirrel monkeys, preferred to pick up and look the card that had the regular image rather than the irregular image. So again, monkeys seem to be sensitive to this dimension of regularity and prefer to interact with the objects that have more regularity than the objects that have less regularity. Another fascinating study, this is an older study, trained monkeys to self-expose themselves to images. So the monkeys were in their little cage and they have a button and they can press the button to see an image, and when they release the button, the image goes away, and when they press the button again, a second image comes on. So they can alternate between 2 images. And the time they spend pressing the button is the time they spend preferring to be seeing that sort of image. And in this study, the author showed that there's a clear preference for color. So the monkeys prefer to be in front of a blue screen rather than be in front of a red screen, and they preferred brighter colors than less brighter colors. And he also was able to show that they tend to prefer to see photographs of animals and people than photographs of flowers. So again, there's a preference for content. And this is the last study I'll be talking about, one of our own studies that we did with the materials supplied by Moshe and Maital. This is the curved and sharp everyday objects. And we compared how humans and great apes interact with these objects. So what we did was to present both objects for a very brief period of time. So you can see 80 milliseconds. And people could choose between the left or the right object to be presented again. So the 2 objects equivalent in the sort of object it is, like 2 jars or 2 telephones or 2 suitcases. One is sharp contours and the other one has sort of roundy contours. And the person is just instructed to press either key, left or right, to see the object again, presented a little larger. So when people are given this choice, they tend to prefer the curved option when it's presented for very brief time. But when they can see the object until they decide, this preference is faded. So it's a 50-50 chance. So this effect for preference for contour, and as Moshe was explaining before, has to do with things that happen very early on and for very brief periods of time, at least in humans. Because we did the same thing with chimpanzees and gorillas, who are already familiar with touch screens, and they were presented with the same objects for very brief presentations in one condition and for longer presentations in another condition. And they could choose between the left and the right object to be presented again. So we did this with the chimpanzees and the gorillas, and what we found is preference for curvature, but only in the condition where the objects were presented until they made a choice. So at least our interpretation has to do with the fact that in the very brief presentations, and if you've noticed in the images before, they are tested in their own. So this is done in Leipzig, where they have the zoo and the gorillas and the chimpanzees have like a free range, and from time to time they're invited to come into the lab, which is sort of an annex, a little room that's annexed. So they go through a little door, and they can interact with these tasks that the humans present to them. So they're there sort of voluntarily, because they get sort of rewards that they don't get if they don't come into the lab. So they work there and they sit there and they move around. So it's possible that with these very short presentations, they're not always looking at the screens like our very well-behaved human participants are. So maybe these flashes of 80 milliseconds are missed on many trials. So in any case, when objects are shown for as long as they want to and they can respond, there's also a preference for the curved alternative in the gorillas and the chimpanzees. So in this section, I think at least these tentative results show that humans share with many other animals a sort of sensitivity and preference towards some formal features, including color and brightness, proportion, regularity, and the curvature of contour. So again, it's not special that humans are not unique in this sensitivity to these sort of features, and they're definitely not unique in these preferences. So if we could draw a tentative phylogeny, cognitive phylogeny of aesthetics, we would say, well, preference for proportion has been shown in birds and mice. So this is something that's already appeared before primates diversify. Preference for regularity appeared at least in the ancestor of anthropoids. So new monkeys, old world monkeys, and hominoids are capable of preferring regularity and sensitive to this feature. Preference for color and brightness appeared at least in the ancestor of old world monkeys and hominoids. And preference for curvature, we have evidence that it appeared at least in the common ancestor of gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans. Now, my guess would be if we continue testing these animals on these features, and we tested, for instance, New World monkeys and prosimians, we would find evidence that many of these sensitivity and preference appeared much earlier, in fact. But this is a cognitive phylogeny of aesthetics based on the data that we have at the moment. So I mean to say that each of the dots would be moving down in that ladder. If we add evidence from the other two sections of the presentation, we would say that the capacity to learn about the formal cues that distinguish art, style, and quality, that also appeared very early on in evolution, even before primates. And the capacity to transfer social preference to neutral stimuli, this is something that again appeared in an ancestor of monkeys and great apes. So this is a tentative phylogeny of aesthetics with the data that we have available. So in conclusion, the conclusion of my talk, I think, would be that aesthetic appreciation arises from brain systems that are very old phylogenetically, and that these brain systems evolve to draw attention to meaningful features of social and non-social objects, events, and situations, and also to value these in relationship to the organism's state. Probably these brain systems evolved in some mosaic fashion, meaning bit by bit and for different reasons and in relation to different evolutionary pressures, and that therefore human aesthetic evaluation is remarkable and we enjoy it a lot, but in the sense that I've been presenting, is not special and definitely not unique. So thank you very much.